Good morning. My name is Lee Kaplan. I'm this year's president of the Obesity Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to Obesity Week 2020. This year, for the first time, it's an interactive meeting online due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we certainly hope that you will enjoy the meeting as much, or at least almost as much, as you have previous Obesity Weeks. It's been a crazy year for all of us, and unfortunately a tragic year for too many of our family, friends, and colleagues. For Obesity Week, there have been changes related to COVID, but also changes related to the fact that for the first year, this Obesity Week is under the exclusive leadership of the Obesity Society. As Matt Hayes will describe in more detail, we've tried to preserve as much of the excitement, education, and science as has been in the previous meetings. We've done our best to organize the meeting in a way that will be interactive as well as educational, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. Using the advantages provided by the online format, we've included several enhancements to our usual meeting, including online meetups, roundtables, mentorship sessions, and the ability for you to review all oral and poster sessions over the next 2 months, the electronic exhibit hall, and more extensive job listings that have been available in the past. Now, 2020 has provided a sobering introduction to the new normal, and we're all responding and learning together. We look forward to your feedback as Obesity Week grows and adapts. Please enjoy the meeting. I want to express big thanks to several people who have made Obesity Week Interactive possible. They include the Obesity Week Leadership Task Force led by Al Levine and including Harvey Grill, Penny Gordon-Larson, Jim Hill, and Steve Smith, who helped us navigate the pathway to a virtual conference. The TOS Executive Committee, who worked tirelessly to guide the development of the new format. The Obesity Week Interactive Task Force, including our council and committee leadership, who guided the new structure and components of Obesity Week Interactive. I want to thank the TOS Program Planning Committee, led by Matt Hayes and Jamy Ard, who had to construct a second online program once the pandemic set in. This is the first time the program committee has had to develop 2 programs in 1 year. I want to thank the office staff, especially Darnella Parks in our meetings group, and Anita Weiler, meetings director, who led a complete reconstruction of Obesity Week in record time and under budget. They are truly our MVPs for this year's meeting. Whether or not this is a 1-year aberrancy or the new normal, we wouldn't be here without their extraordinary contributions of all of the people that I've mentioned. Thank you to all, and I'll turn it over to Matt Hayes to describe Obesity Week Interactive version 1 in more detail.
Thank you, Lee. Welcome, as he said, to Obesity Week 2020, brought to you by the Obesity Society. I'm Matt Hayes, and it's been my pleasure and honor to serve as this year's program committee chair. Together with Jamy Ard and all of the members of the TOS program committee, we worked quite a lot to first design what was going to be a wonderful meeting in Atlanta. And then due to the COVID pandemic, we switched gears and rapidly were able to reformat our meeting towards an online platform. This year has been challenging, and we've attempted to not let that affect the quality of the science, the capability of social interactions, or the opportunity to showcase our own science and provide constructive feedback amongst our peers, colleagues, and friends. So in this year's online obesity format, we have 2 separate channels that will run broadcasting on demand and in-person recordings that we are calling broadcast recordings. Don't worry, unlike in normal years where you have to pick and choose to decide which room you may want to attend a given talk at a certain time, and there's often conflicts at the in-person Obesity Week. With this year's format, you can now go and obtain over 2 months all of the information presented at the Obesity Week at your own time and leisure. And we hope that this enhanced feature will not only allow you an opportunity to soak up all that is being presented at Obesity Week 2020, but also allow for an advancement of science in the treatment, care, and prevention of obesity. Without question, there has been a lot of press that has come under review with regard to COVID-19 and its association and comorbidities associated with obesity. We've also made sure to include the cutting edge science surrounding obesity and COVID-19 in this year's meeting. I need to express a deep sense of thanks and gratitude to many people that helped bring this meeting together. In particular, Lee Kaplan and Tony Camuzzi from the executive committee, as well as the other members of the executive committee who worked hand in hand with the program committee leadership to develop this online program. We also drew a lot of information and groundwork from the task force that was put together in order to help us navigate these challenging times. Anita Weiler and Darnella Parks in the obesity office were incredible, and I cannot express my thanks enough to those individuals. My program committee co-chair, Jamy Ard, as well as past year's chair that I learned a lot from, Paul McLean, were also extremely valuable through this challenging year. In addition, I need to express another set of thanks to Paul and his research committee, who for the first time this year took on the burden of doing the abstract reviews to help us pick and choose the best abstracts that we would include in oral sessions, as well as those that would be well fit within a online platform for poster presentations. This is going to be one of the, I think, most important years to stay together as a society, especially in this virtual context. And to this end, you'll have the opportunity for individual breakout sessions with colleagues and friends. You can join roundtables that will be open and viewable to the public and discuss the most cutting edge technology or the newest bit of science that we want to showcase to our friends and colleagues. You can also attend and gamify as you're going through this meeting, earning points and awards for involvement and participation throughout the meeting. We hope that you enjoy TAS this year, and it will be our sincere hope that every bit of this meeting is as good as it is in years past, and we look forward to seeing you all virtually in just a matter of a couple of weeks. Did we lose him?
Thanks, Matt. We'll now start the meeting and with the first session. First session today is the presidential plenary session. And for this year, we've redesigned this session to include several brief presentations on a variety of exciting topics from colleagues who are making seminal contributions to our understanding of obesity. Each speaker will elaborate on the perspective provided by their topic of choice. Each talk will be 10 minutes, so it's a brief talk, but I think together they will give us a sense of the breadth and the excitement of what's going on in obesity today. This morning's program includes presentations by Joe Proietto on the physiology of the weight-reduced state, by Sadaf Farooqi on the genetics of thinness. Carel Le Roux will talk about the implications on treating obesity as a disease. Darleen Sandoval will talk about the physiology of bariatric surgery. Dan Drucker will talk about the challenges of anti-obesity drug development. Jamy Ard will speak on addressing disparities in a productive and meaningful way. Manal Abdelmalek will talk about addressing obesity as a means of controlling non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Ania Jastreboff will talk on the effects of obesity and viral infections, including COVID-19, but viral infections more broadly. And finally, Joe Nadglowski will talk about amplifying and responding to the patient voice as we pursue control, a better control of obesity. We'll end this session with the presentation of the Presidential Medals of Excellence and some brief reflections as I conclude my presidential year. I want to welcome all of you to Obesity Week once again. I want to welcome each of the speakers in this morning's session. I look forward to your talks and thank you for kicking off Obesity Week Interactive for 2020. To everyone listening and watching, please enjoy the meeting. As Matt said, we have a lot of enhancements that we've added to the online meeting that are uniquely capable because of the online approach. And we hope that they will enhance your enjoyment for the meeting and will enhance the scientific and clinical value of the meeting to your professional careers. We look forward to your feedback. We want to learn what works and what works less well. We want to learn where we can improve the meeting for next year. We suspect that as we move back toward an in-person meeting over the next year or two, there'll be certain parts of this meeting that we will keep because they actually add value. But of course, all of us eventually want to get back to meeting with each other, being in the same room at the same time to discuss the excitement of what's going on in our professional and personal lives. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me to speak about the biology of the weight-reduced state. Those of you who treat obesity will know the frustrating fact that many patients who lose weight eventually regain it, as shown in this study here by Wadden et al., irrespective of what type of diet is used, whether it's very low calorie, modified diet plus behavior therapy, or very low calorie diet plus behavior therapy, the regain after 5 years is almost complete. Why is it difficult to maintain weight loss? To understand this, we need to understand briefly the regulation of body weight. Weight is regulated in the hypothalamus, and in particular in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus are two types of nerves, the so-called NPY nerves that also express AGRP that stimulate hunger, and the POMC nerves that produce alpha MSH and CART that inhibit hunger. They then project to other areas of the hypothalamus, and the sensation of wanting to eat or not is felt. There are many inputs into the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, but those that we'll talk about today include hormones that circulate in the blood. And there are approximately 10 of these hormones. Ghrelin from the stomach stimulates hunger, while other hormones from the gut, fat, and the pancreas inhibit hunger. Now, soon after the discovery of leptin, this study appeared in which a group of individuals were asked to lose weight. In the black squares, you see BMI coming down, and leptin levels, as weight loss started, leptin levels dropped significantly. After ghrelin was discovered, they found that ghrelin rose after breakfast and then fell, rose before lunch and then fell, etc., before dinner and then fell. But after weight loss, ghrelin did the same thing, rising and falling with meals, but at a higher level. So ghrelin is higher, leptin is lower following weight loss. In our own study, we measured cholecystokinin, which is one of the hormones that makes us feel full after we eat. And here, prior to weight loss, in the dark blue line, you see that CCK rising following a meal at time 0 and then falling over the next 4 hours. But following weight loss at week 9 in the pale blue line with triangles, you see that CCK is hardly released following weight loss. Then in 2011, we undertook this study on 50 individuals that we asked to lose approximately 12 or so kilograms. We studied them prior to weight loss, immediately after weight loss, and a year later. On the right panel, you see that there's leptin, and we reproduce what had been shown previously, that leptin drops following weight loss here at week 10. But a year later, it was still lower than baseline, and the increase seemed to be proportional to the trend in weight regain. We measured other hormones, including ghrelin, amylin, PYY, and CCK. Here shown pre-weight loss. The meal is at time 0, and following a meal, ghrelin falls, as we know, and then gradually rises before the next meal, whereas amylin rises and then falls, CCK rises and falls, and PYY rises a little bit. Immediately following weight loss, ghrelin is higher. It still goes up and down with meals, but it's higher, whereas amylin is lower, CCK is lower, PYY is lower. And a year later, they were still there. They hadn't gone back to baseline. Now, did this change in hunger controlling hormones change hunger ratings as measured by a visual analog scale? Yes, it did. Here's hunger and desire to eat, both falling following the meal, but then gradually rising. Immediately after weight loss, hunger was higher and desire to eat is higher. And a year later, it was still higher. The individuals remained hungry a year after weight loss. Then we did this study where we looked at the rate of weight loss, if it had any impact on regain. And we show here that regain was the same whether you lost weight gradually or rapidly. And in this study, we followed people for 3 years or 144 weeks. We measured leptin and ghrelin in this study. You can see here that leptin falls, and the rate of weight loss didn't influence the rate at which the hormone fell, but then it rose at 2 years, at 1 year rather, and it was up almost above normal at 3 years. But there are error bars here because some individuals, as you can see here, there are error bars. There were a few individuals that had maintained weight better than some others. Ghrelin rose, and again, the rate of fall didn't make any difference. But at 3 years, there was still some tendency for ghrelin to be higher. And in the paper, you'll read these two statements. In those who regained less than 25% of lost weight, of which there were 15, leptin remained below baseline at week 144. And when we combine data from both groups, ghrelin still remains significantly higher than baseline at 144 weeks. The defense of weight also involves changes in energy expenditure. We know that thyroid hormones can influence energy expenditure, but following weight loss, T3 levels fall and reverse T3 levels rise. This would give the equivalent of being mildly hypothyroid. this study was done many years ago in 1995, and they found that with 10% weight loss and 20% weight loss, energy expenditure, the observed minus predicted energy expenditure, was lower by around 300 kilocalories. And when the components of energy expenditure were assessed, here shown total energy expenditure, resting energy expenditure, and non-resting energy expenditure measured following weight loss and then a year later, we see that total energy expenditure dropped immediately after weight loss in the open circles, and then a year later it was still down. And most of this energy expenditure fall was due to non-resting energy expenditure changes, that is spontaneous activity, which remain low a year after weight loss. Resting energy expenditure didn't change very much. And then this paper appeared in 2016 where they looked at metabolic adaptation 6 years after the Biggest Loser competition. Here shown a resting metabolic rate change of less than 600 kilocalories per day, 30 weeks into the program after some weight loss, and then 6 years later. And metabolic adaptation had dropped at 30 weeks, and it was still low and even a little bit lower 6 years after weight loss. And in this study, they measured leptin at 6 years after weight loss is still lower than at baseline. So to conclude, the cause for the failure of most weight-reduced patients with obesity to maintain weight loss is due to the long-term persistence of powerful biological mechanisms designed to return the individual to their genetically determined set point. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be able to share some of our work on genetics with you today, and particularly how we're thinking about both obesity and obesity resistance. Now, we've known for a long time that genes can influence our weight, and the best data for this comes from studies of twins, where identical twins tend to have a very similar body weight as compared to non-identical twins. We also know from studies of families that adopted children have a weight that is very similar to their biological parents rather than the adoptive parents with whom they share the childhood environment. And studies in families have shown that genes influence energy intake, how full we feel after a given test meal, basal metabolic rate, and the physiological response to exercise is also highly heritable. Now, we're familiar with the huge heterogeneity that we see when we treat people in different ways for weight loss. But actually, the best evidence comes from bariatric surgery, where we know that Roux-en-Y bypass response is also highly heritable. Of course, genes don't act on their own, and they interact with the environment. And where the environment is a major driver towards weight gain, it's our genetic background that influences where we lie on the given spectrum, with some people much more prone to severe obesity and some people able to remain thin even in an obesogenic environment. Now, some of the first discoveries about specific genes that can affect weight have come from the study of patients with severe obesity who've been shown to have disorders that all disrupt a key pathway involved in leptin signaling. Now, the pathway is shown here on this schematic, whereby leptin, which is secreted by adipose tissue, acts in the brain to regulate weight over long periods of time by sending signals through distinct neuronal populations that either tell us to stop eating or to eat. And several genetic disorders have now been identified, shown in the left-hand panel, which effectively disrupt the signal through this limb of the pathway that normally is there to tell us to stop eating. And that's the melanocortin pathway, as shown here. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because finding these genes and diagnosing these disorders is important for patients, as has been recognized now in clinical guidelines, which recommend genetic testing, particularly when obesity starts at a very young age, before the age of 5, and is very severe in nature. And now it's important because we have treatments for some of these genetic disorders. We know that leptin deficiency is entirely treatable, but also now a number of disorders in this melanocortin pathway can be treated with a melanocortin-4 receptor agonist. And it's also important for our patients because finding an explanation for severe obesity, particularly in childhood, can alleviate some of the stigma that goes with these disorders. Now, it's interesting that this pathway, of course, is critical to regulating weight, and therefore variation in this pathway can affect the whole spectrum of weight in people. Now, here's just one example with a melanocortin-4 receptor, which is a key control point downstream of leptin in the brain, and also as a G protein coupled receptor is an important therapeutic target. Now, what we showed previously is that there are quite a lot of variants in MC4R, particularly if you look at 500,000 people in UK Biobank. And when you study all of these variants in cells, they have different effects. Some of them cause a loss of function, which we know is associated with obesity, but others can cause a gain of function. And interestingly, these gain of function variants are associated with protection from obesity and indeed protection from type 2 diabetes. Now, how do these variants actually do that? Well, normally when we think about a receptor such as MC4R, after it's done its job, after it's completed signaling, which effectively is there to tell you to stop eating and reduce food intake, a receptor is normally taken inside the cell for recycling. But genetic variants, which are found in about 6% of the people in UK Biobank and therefore in general populations, what they actually do is they prevent the receptor from either being internalized or actually make it recycle more quickly and get back onto the cell surface. So effectively, MC4R sits around telling you you don't need to eat, you're actually quite full. And this probably explains why people are protected from obesity. Now, these are just a couple of examples, and we're looking further now into how other genes might affect the regulation of weight. As I've mentioned, most of the data to date comes from people with severe obesity who have rare variants that disrupt specific pathways. Many colleagues have been doing genome-wide association studies and have found common variants, each of which has a small effect, but when you add them together, you can actually explain quite a bit of this variability in weight across the spectrum. And that was really illustrated very nicely in this paper by Carel et al. Last year, who found that if you add up a risk score of 2 million variants, you can now predict who develops obesity. And as you can see here in the dark bars, the risk score is much higher in people who are overweight or obese, and the people in the highest decile for this risk score are more likely to develop severe obesity over time. So we're beginning to be able to measure all of this genetic risk that we've known for a long time exists. Now, one of the things that we've been interested in very recently is this end of the spectrum, people who are thin in an otherwise obesogenic environment. And we've recruited a cohort of thin people who are otherwise healthy and have undertaken some genetic studies in that cohort. And what we've seen is that actually there are regions of the genome that are associated with obesity, which we knew. There are actually some new regions associated with thinness, and there are also some regions that code for weight regulation. So example, FTO shown here in the purple, pink, is actually a region for obesity, whereas CADM2 is a region for thinness, and MC4R is a region for weight regulation. Now, we can add up these risk scores, and we know the risk scores are generally higher in obese people, but they're very low in thin people. So essentially, people who can remain very thin have specific regions of the genome that are keeping them thin, but they also have less of the regions of the genome that we know increase a person's risk of obesity. And really what I think one of the aims for us, and I hope for many others, is to try to use insights from genetics to identify new targets for weight loss therapy. Now, many genes will be disrupted and cause severe obesity, for example, but otherwise, if we can find the genes whose disruption results in thinness, that could be incredibly helpful. It's often easier to design an antagonist, something that blocks the function you're interested, than it is to design an agonist. We know many of the genes affect eating behavior, and as we understand more about eating behavior, we can perhaps target some of these pathways in a more specific manner. But also there may be other mechanisms, including thermogenesis and how we utilize stored fat, that could be coming into play. And here's just one example of someone who I think could be teaching us about these mechanisms, This is a thin individual who were from our cohort stilts that we were studying. As you can see, a young man with a BMI of 16, otherwise entirely well, normal bloods, no other distinguishing clinical features. And when we bring him in for an overfeeding study, we find that despite giving him a significant excess of calories, there's absolutely no change in his body weight over several days. Now, we're very intrigued to understand the mechanism that may be driving thinness in individuals like this. So really, just to finish, we understand there's huge heritability in terms of how much weight we gain. We're really interested in trying to understand that and use genetics as a tool and hopefully to find new treatments for patients. Thank you.
My name is Carel Le Roux. I'm a clinician scientist that work in University College Dublin, and I'm talking about treating obesity as a disease. And I think where we have to start is going back to the Renaissance. This is a famous Botticelli depicting Dante's Inferno, showing the 7 mortal sins, and 2 of these are gluttony and sloth. And this has really stopped us treating obesity as a disease because we thought that obesity was a sin. It was a willful act. And therefore, we did not put it in the same box as we put all our other chronic diseases, such as hypertension and dyslipidemia and type 2 diabetes. So understanding this can help us to treat obesity as a disease. So first, the question is, before we start treating it as a disease, is obesity a disease? And although it's hotly debated, I think the consensus now is that it is a disease. And certainly helping people think about this is thinking about how we treat peripheral edema. Is peripheral edema a disease? And if it was a disease, then we should just say that the treatment for it is to urinate more and drink less water. And unfortunately, that's how many people think obesity should be treated, by moving more and eating less. But in fact, if you have a sign like increased water, increased fluid underneath the skin, in the same way as we think about increased adipose tissue underneath the skin, what we need to first understand is what is the differential diagnosis. And therefore, our treatments vary widely, whether or not the increase fluid under the skin is caused by liver disease, or it's caused by cardiac disease, or it's caused by renal disease, or many other diseases. And therefore, we are very good at treating peripheral edema because we are thinking about which organ is responsible for this, and therefore we can focus our treatment. We are not this good when it comes to treating increased adipose tissue under the skin or in the visceral organs, because we have not yet focused on what organ it is that we need to target. And here's another great example of a specific type of obesity. Here's leptin deficiency, and the child on the left and the child on the right is exactly the same child, but all that has happened is that this type of obesity was treated very successfully with leptin therapy. So what we now are seeing is that obesity may not be one disease, it may be multiple diseases, and thinking that we're going to find a one silver bullet that's going to treat everybody is probably not going to be the most successful way of treating obesities as a disease. So we have to ask our question, which organ are we treating? And this has really vexed us in not really helping us move forward, because we thought for a long time the organ that we were treating are the adipose tissue. In fact, that may just be a result of this disease of obesities that we are thinking about. And then when we look at gene-wide association studies, we see that at least 80% of the genes associated with obesity points to the central nervous system. And when we actually delve inside the central nervous system, we can see that it is the subcortical areas of the brain. I'm highlighting the hypothalamus, but also the nucleus tractus solitarius, the area postrema. All of these subcortical areas of the brain are vitally important when it comes to obesity etiologies and which organ we need to target. We have again try to target the cortical areas of the brain with our cognitive behavior therapies, etc. And what we have seen is that has been not as successful as when we actually first start with focusing on the subcortical areas of the brain, as that is where our treatment targets should be. So I'm going to summarize this part and say, if we simplify it, if we're going to have successful treatments such as diet approaches, exercise, medications, or surgical treatments, we know as clinicians when these treatments are successful, because the patients come back to us and they say, since you've started this treatment, life has been so easy, because for the first time, I'm not feeling hungry. And for the first time when I consume food, I feel satisfied. And therefore, my behaviors are becoming natural. We refer to these as appetitive behaviors. Food-seeking behaviors are becoming normal. And of course, this is because our treatments, when they are successful, are targeting the subcortical areas of the brain. Again, I'm just highlighting the arcuate nucleus here as an example, but it targets these areas and therefore leads to success. That is not to diminish the other parts of the brain, and we know how interconnected the brain is and how the subcortical areas also influences the cortical areas. But your mother and my mother have all told us the same thing, that hunger is the best source. So if somebody has a biological drive that makes them feel more hungry, or that stops them feeling satisfied after a meal, what you will see is that they have increased behavior, food-seeking behaviors, so-called appetitive behaviors, and therefore all food looks palatable, and especially high-calorie dense foods appear even more palatable. So that means that we have to treat obesity with a combination of approaches. There is no point in just focusing on the subcortical areas. We also have to think how we can use cognitive behavior therapy and other approaches to combine the entire brain, both the subcortical and cortical areas of the brain. So I'm going to summarize again by saying, if you are normal weight, the more food you would eat, the more satisfied you would feel. But if we look at people with obesity, we can see that this curve is shifted to the right and more calories are required before people feel satisfied. If we are going to treat obesity as a disease, what we need to do is shift this curve to the left and allow people to feel satisfied with fewer calories. And that is now becoming possible using diet approaches, exercise, medications, and surgical treatments. So what is our typical algorithm that we need to work through? Of course, we start with self-directed lifestyle changes, and if that is not enough, we can escalate to professionally directed lifestyle changes. Again, if this does not work, don't force your patients to go around in circles. Rather escalate treatment, adding medications. Again, if that doesn't work, try different types of medications or escalate it to surgery. And again, if that is not successful, then use a combination of approaches. So what we see is we can treat obesity as a disease, provided that we understand it's a complex and chronic disease. And all we have to do is just use our normal approaches that we use for all of our other chronic diseases. Obesity is not more special, but neither is it less special than our other chronic diseases. So please allow me to thank the team at home that's doing all the hard work, our international collaborators. And what we have found very helpful is actually this phrase. It was a throwaway phrase that we used in clinic, explaining obesity as a disease to patients and then saying to them, you know, this is a disease and it's not your fault. And when you say this, you can see grown men crying. But what we can say to patients, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And it is my responsibility to treat this as a chronic disease. And therefore, we can be successful in the longer term. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak. It's an honor to be included in this presidential plenary session. I was given the topic of what can we learn from bariatric surgery. Whenever I talk about bariatric surgery, I like to show this slide because it summarizes massive amount of data that we've collected over the years, but it really highlights the widespread physiological effects of vertical sleeve gastrectomy. In this surgery, 80% of the stomach along the greater curvature is removed and there's no intestinal rearrangement. And so we not only see weight loss and improvements in glucose homeostasis, but we see changes in lipid handling, microbiome, and postprandial gut peptides. And the animals also change their feeding behavior such that their patterns change as well as their food choice. And so to us, bariatric surgery is a cool way to understand the role of the GI tract in regulating whole animal physiology. The topic I'm going to focus on today is what can BSG tell us about the impact of biological sex on metabolism or whole animal physiology. This topic is important for many reasons, but for one, 80% of bariatric surgery patients happen to be women. And despite this, 90% of the preclinical work, and in everybody else's defense, including my own, are in male rodents. And so really, if we're trying to use preclinical work to understand mechanisms of bariatric surgery, then we need to be taking biological sex into consideration, because even though the end result might be the same, the pathway to get there might be different. And if you're trying to target the mechanisms for those differences, then we need to take sex into consideration. So to try to answer this question, Chelsea Hutch, a postdoctoral fellow in the lab at the time, she's now a research assistant professor at the University of Michigan, took age-matched males and females. She put them on a high-fat diet for 12 weeks and then did sham or VSG surgery. Now, the typical experimental paradigm that we do is we, after surgery, after a brief period of liquid diet, we put the animals back on high-fat diet. So this is of course, what you hope the patients don't do, in that you would like for them to change their diet after surgery. But here we're really trying to understand the independent effect of VSG on and mediating changes in metabolism. And so we're trying to control for diet here. To make a long story short, what we see is that males and females lose weight and improve glucose tolerance, just as you would predict. And I'm not showing this data because I want to highlight one of the big differences that we did see. And that is that males, we've seen repeatedly have decrease in hepatic triglycerides after vertical sleeve gastrectomy, despite the fact that they're maintained on a high-fat diet. And also, this is independent of weight loss. So if you compare them to a pair-fed group, they still have a significantly greater reduction in their hepatic triglyceride levels. However, the females see no such reduction. Now, I'm expressing this data relative to their sham counterparts, and that is because the females come into, or they're resistant to accumulating fat in their livers in response to a high-fat diet. So one possibility for these findings is simply that the females are at a floor effect, right? Their levels of triglycerides are already low, and VSG can't lower them any further. So to try to address this question, we talked to Durga Segar, a collaborator at University of Michigan, and we borrowed one of her experimental paradigms. So what she typically does is she takes age-matched males and females, she puts them on a high-fat diet for 12 weeks, and then she switches them to a chow diet. And when she does this, she sees very prominent decreases in body weight, improvements in adipose tissue inflammation, and improvements in glucose tolerance. So for completeness, we included this group in our experimental paradigm as well. And for completeness, we also included a vertical sleeve gastrectomy group that was also switched to chow. So I'm going right to the punchline here and showing you hepatic triglycerides. And these first two panels of data you've already seen. But these second two groups are the animals that were fed chow or switched to the chow diet after surgery. And what you can see is that switching the animals to chow in and of itself has a very prominent effect of reducing hepatic triglycerides. And so, and although it doesn't come out statistically significant, we almost see a stepwise decrease with vertical sleeve gastrectomy plus chow, suggesting potential additivity between the two interventions. Now, when we do the same thing in females, the question is, will we have this further reduction with the chow diet in hepatic triglycerides, or are their levels so low that we won't see this decrease? but instead we actually do see this decrease. So switching the animals to chow causes a significant reduction in hepatic triglycerides in the females compared to the high-fat fed females that see no significant reduction with vertical sleeve gastrectomy. So these data suggest that the females are not responding to surgery the same way the males are in terms of driving that decrease in hepatic triglycerides. So of course we want to understand the mechanisms for that, and typically the first approach when you're trying to understand mechanisms for sex differences is to implicate reproductive hormones. We did the ovarectomy study, and we do see blended weight loss and improvements in glucose homeostasis in the overrectomized animals, suggesting that those reproductive hormones are necessary for VSG-induced weight loss. But the pattern of hepatic triglyceride responses were pretty much the same compared to the intact females. So we don't think that the reproductive hormones are driving the differences or lack thereof of the VSG-induced changes in hepatic triglycerides. And so to try to understand what might be driving those differences, we approached a collaborator, Praveen Sethafi, who's at Cornell University. And what we did is we took the livers from these experimental groups and then tried to look at their molecular responses. And so to just give a broad picture summary of the data that we found before I get to specific endpoints, the males who had decreased hepatic triglycerides had 22 microRNAs that were altered by high-fat diet or VSG. 7 of the microRNAs that were altered by high-fat diet were reversed by vertical sleeve gastrectomy. So those differences were reversed. 186 genes that were altered by, there were 186 genes that were altered by VSG in the males, and 47 of the genes that were altered by high-fat diet were reversed by VSG. So really widespread changes in the molecular profile of the male livers after vertical sleeve gastrectomy. So what about the females? The females saw no change in hepatic triglycerides, and maybe not surprisingly, they didn't see very many changes in terms of their molecular profile as well. We only found 1 microRNA that was altered and 52 genes that were altered by VSG. There was minimal additional impact of overrectomy on these particular molecular profiles. So what were the specific genes that we saw? So I'm just highlighting a few. So this first graph shows changes in VNN, which you can see have a nice significant reduction when you switch the animals to chow or do VSG. This particular gene is, its expression is increased in insulin-resistant mice. It functions to increase gluconeogenesis and also improves a knockout of this gene induces improved liver triglyceride profiles in diabetic mouse models. Side X shows the same pattern of responses with decreased expression with the switch to chow or VSG. This is a lipid droplet-associated protein, and it promotes triglyceride accumulation in the liver. Now, I wanted to show NHO because this gene shows a different profile compared to the previous 2 genes. In this gene, you really see no impact of diet on its gene expression, but vertical sleeve gastrectomy causes a big increase in its expression. This gene codes for a circulating peptide that seems to function to increase hepatic steatosis and body fat levels in DIO mice. Now, I'm showing you all of this in the male rats. What happened to the females? Well, really, kind of nothing. We don't really see big differences whether the animals were switched to chow or had VSG, and absolutely we see no differences between sham versus VSG. Interestingly, SIDEC gene expression is generally very low in the females compared to the males, suggesting it's not as important regulator of lipid metabolism in females. What about those microRNAs? So MIR 802, 103, and 107 showed similar profiles where you see a significant decrease compared to the sham high-fat fed animals when the animals were switched to chow or had vertical sleeve gastrectomy. And these MIRs in particular are interesting because all 3 are well-established markers of obesity and hepatic lipid accumulation. Anti-MIR 103 and 107 additionally are compounds that are already in clinical trials for NAFLD. But again, we see no impact of VSG on expression of any of these MIRs in the females. So to summarize, it seems that the males are more responsive to VSG in terms of their molecular profile at the level of the liver, and this seems to be driving the differences that we're seeing in hepatic lipid levels. I want to highlight the fact that even though we get decreases in body mass and improvements in glucose homeostasis in males and females, they're not getting there through the same pathway. And for the females in particular, those responses are reproductive hormone and diet dependent in terms of the weight loss and the glucose dependent and glucose improvements. And in addition, there's a completely different hepatic lipid handling response to VSG between the sexes. So lastly, when we think about what we can learn from bariatric surgery, I hope you buy that VSG can also be used as a tool to study sex differences in hepatic lipid metabolism. And with that, I will thank the people that actually do the work in the lab. Chelsea Hutch led this work really from beginning to end. I need to thank my collaborators who have really added a lot to this project, Praveen Sethapi and Durga Singer. I want to highlight that Kisa Kim will be telling us about the impact or what we can learn about intestinal differentiation through VSG, and he'll be presenting on Wednesday morning. So please tune in for that. And I will leave you with our self-selected Bitmojis for the lab, which has recently moved to University of Colorado. These are our fellows there, and we have a few stragglers left at University of Michigan to finish some projects. Thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Jamy Ard. I'm going to spend the next several minutes talking to you about addressing disparities meaningfully. However, in order to do that, I felt we needed to first discuss why the most advanced country in the world has such poor health outcomes for some segments of its population. Where did these disparities come from, and how did we get here? I want to use this quote from James Baldwin to frame this presentation. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. From the birth of this nation to present day, Blacks and other disadvantaged groups have endured health outcomes that are generally worse than those of advantaged whites. History shows that the disparities in health outcomes we observe are not by happenstance, but the result of intentional decisions designed to limit access to health care. There have been several examples throughout history that illustrate this point, starting from slavery to the current pandemic of COVID-19. In the next couple of slides, I've just pulled together some statistics to highlight some of the disparities that I think about or deal with on a regular basis. These are just a few of the examples that we could talk about all day. However, I won't dwell on them except to say that they do exist for people of color and those in lower socioeconomic groups. The three examples include type 2 diabetes, as shown here, preventable death from cardiovascular disease and stroke, taken from my home county in North Carolina, and obviously obesity, which likely drives the previous examples. To understand the origins of disparities, I had to go back to the beginning of Blacks' existence in this country. Understanding how healthcare was approached for slaves is quite informative for framing our current context. The slave owner's perspective was to keep his investment safe while providing the bare minimum required to do so. Typical rations provided for by slave owners are shown here. The rations were supplemented by what could be grown or caught. Conditions on plantations fostered spread of infections and disease and parasites. And nutritional status increased susceptibility to those diseases. All of this was compounded by the prejudices of white physicians. As the status of American physicians increased, they became central figures in providing quote unquote evidence of inferiority of Blacks through pseudoscience, going so far as to create diseases that were peculiar to the Black condition, like wanting to be free. However, they ignored the basic tenets of science that they professed to promote, ignoring the cause and effect of poor conditions and undernutrition. After the Civil War, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, which was designed to address the needs of free Blacks and poor whites in the South. Healthcare eventually became part of the mission. Blacks suffered from disease outbreaks in encampments that included smallpox, yellow fever, and cholera. And even though legislators knew the benefits of sanitation and quarantining, freed slaves were not assisted in managing these outbreaks, and mortality was extraordinarily high. The rationale for willfully ignoring these problems was twofold: keep the infections from spreading into white communities, and providing assistance to free slaves would only breed dependence. Ultimately, the ruling class felt that a healthy Negro population would upend the social order. Therefore, disease was weaponized to limit the ability of the freed slaves to pursue the basic tenets of what America promised for everyone else: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It became clear that a freed Black was less valuable than an enslaved Black. Many felt the Black race was inherently predisposed to poverty and unhealthy living conditions, leading to higher morbidity and mortality. This perspective completely ignored the social circumstances that existed to create those very conditions. Practically, this meant that life insurance was not accessible to Blacks, with many actuaries believing that the Black race would go extinct by the late 1900s. It could be said that the life insurance industry came full circle for African Americans, who were the first to be insured for the wrong reasons and the last to be insured for the right reasons. As we move forward in history, we see the South rise during the post-Reconstruction era to cement a segregated society as a way of life. The Southern states consolidated influence by voting as a bloc to help limit federal oversight and maintain states' rights. Segregation had a direct influence on Blacks' ability to access healthcare system. One example of how this power directly affected disparities is the Hill-Burton Act, passed in 1946. This act provided construction grants and loans to communities to assist in building of healthcare facilities. By the turn of the century, about 6,800 facilities in 4,000 communities had been in some part financed by this law. As a bipartisan law, it codified the idea of separate but equal in hospitals and healthcare facilities. Southern segregationists were needed to pass the legislation. They exacted the compromise that each locality could maintain segregated facilities if they desired. John Kinney Jr., who was the president of the NMA, National Medical Association, the nation's oldest and largest organization of Black physicians, in 1963 explained, racial discrimination in medical services and facilities was understood to be, quote, one of the prime reasons why Negro infant mortality is from 2 to 5 times greater than white infant mortality, why white women are 5 times less likely to die in childbirth than Negro women, and why Negro life expectancy is almost 7 years less than white life expectancy, end quote. Ultimately, a group of dentists and physicians from Greensboro, North Carolina, sued local Moses Cone Hospital to gain access to that facility for their patients, and ultimately prevailed in 1963. Their victory outlawed the idea of racially segregated healthcare. During the post-Reconstruction era, we can also see another major development in healthcare that contributes to health disparities. Before World War II, as medical care and hospital-based care became more accepted, hospitals and physicians needed a better way to get paid consistently by more than just the wealthy. During World War II, there was a labor shortage, and that led to wage freezes to avoid inflation in wages. Companies circumvented this by offering health insurance as a benefit to attract employees. The IRS subsequently made those health benefits exempt from taxation. This made health insurance most affordable when acquired through a job. If you didn't have insurance through your employer, or you weren't wealthy and could afford to pay for your health care on your own, then typically you did not access health care. This meant that insurance through employment becomes the norm, but companies discriminated against African Americans. And as a result, Blacks often worked in positions without health insurance benefits. Therefore, Blacks were largely kept out of the health insurance market through no fault of their own. And without health insurance coverage, healthcare is a remedy of last resort, leading to poor health outcomes, driven by increased prevalence of preventable diseases. Today, I would argue that many of the same forces are in play, and most uninsured are working individuals who do not have the fortune of working at a company that can provide insurance as a benefit. We now move forward to 2019, 2020, and we have different ways of thinking about race and factors that influence health outcomes. We know that important factors like access to health care has a direct impact on health outcomes. Even though we understand this, we are having a difficult time moving away from what has been a very entrenched way of thinking about health. Individuals just need to take personal responsibility. If assistance is provided, it will breed dependence. Even though the odds may be stacked against you, if you just work hard enough, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you will get access to health care. However, the reality we observe suggests that vulnerable groups are still being devastated by chronic diseases. And now, as a result of the pandemic, these vulnerabilities are exposed to an even greater extent. Blacks and other people of color are dying at higher rates from COVID. In our state of North Carolina, we see similar trends, and we see very high rates of infection in Latinx communities. COVID has shown a bright spotlight on a sore spot that we have not taken seriously. This pandemic has highlighted the life and death consequences of our inability to protect the most vulnerable in our society. I come back to our opening quote from James Baldwin. We are now face to face with this history and its tentacles that continue to reach into our present day, keeping us mired down in the way that we've always done things, but hoping for a different outcome. The question is, what will we do? I admit, I don't have the answers to solve all of the issues related to health disparities, and there's no way I could even begin to start doing that in a 10-minute talk. But I will offer some thoughts informed by the history that I've just shared with you. I think we need to think structurally and systematically. We need to each take some personal responsibility and not expect that experts in health disparities research will create a solution. We can all do a part, whether it is actively engaging in research focused on disparities or just applying a disparities lens to the work that you are already doing. Are you advocating for the expansion of access to healthcare? And when you see racism, are you coming off the sideline to call it out? I'll end with a plug for a wonderful series of discussions on engaging groups who are underrepresented in academia, sponsored by the UAB NORC and supported by NADDK. All of the recorded seminars can be found at the link provided in the QR code. I encourage you to listen, and I encourage you to engage. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Manila Abdelmalek. I'm professor of medicine at Duke University. I'll be presenting on non-alcoholic steatohepatitis and the importance of treating obesity. I'd like to thank Dr. Kaplan and the program organizers for the opportunity to speak at Obesity Week 2020. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is endemic. In fact, this is a global epidemic with a prevalence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease ranging anywhere between 20 to 30%. The progressive form of this condition, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or NASH, has been noted to occur in up to 6.5% of the global population. This is currently a top indication for liver transplantation and a major contributor to the increasing incidence and prevalence of hepatocellular carcinoma. There is an immense economic burden, both in the United States and in Europe, due to obesity-related liver disease. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is the umbrella term that encompasses a very dynamic and modifiable disease that ranges anywhere from simple steatosis, which does not incur any liver-related morbidity and mortality, to the intermediate and progressive form of steatohepatitis. Patients with steatohepatitis or NASH can progress to cirrhosis with complications of end-stage liver disease and liver cancer. Lifestyle modification is a must for all patients, irrespective of where they are in their disease stage. And like obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is associated with both epigenetic and genetic modifiers, as well as environmental risk factors that can incur an increased risk for disease progression. Patients with NASH is the cohort of patients that is currently being targeted for anti-NASH therapies in clinical trials. The treatment of obesity and associated comorbidities can modify the natural history of NAFLD and NASH. The burden of NAFLD increases with obesity, with the United States being at the top of the pyramid. The risk for NAFLD and NASH increases linearly with increased BMI. There's anywhere between a 4 to a 14-fold higher risk of NAFLD and NASH in patients with higher BMIs compared to lean controls. And 80% of patients who have a BMI over 40 have NAFLD. So the treatment of obesity is the foundation of care, particularly for those with NASH. A 5% reduction in BMI infers a 25% relative reduction in quantitative liver fat by MR-PDFF. And the systematic review of 23 patients' weight reduction anywhere between 4 to 10% consistently improves measures of liver fat and serum aminotransferases. And as you can see here by a meta-analysis published in JAMA just last year, that weight loss improves liver enzymes consistently across the majority of studies. And likewise, weight loss improves hepatic steatosis across many of the studies, which rendered quantitative assessment of liver fat content. But what does weight loss actually do to NASH and liver injury? In a very eloquent study by Villar Gomez, which evaluated paired liver biopsies in 261 patients with NASH who underwent a 52-week lifestyle modification intervention, demonstrated that with increased degrees of weight loss, this resulted in increased improvement in necroinflammatory liver injury and even resolution of NASH in a majority of patients who achieved at least a 7% weight loss and improvement in fibrosis in up to nearly half of patients who achieved a 10% weight loss. Unfortunately, less than 10% of patients who were able to sustain their weight loss at 1 year. So both the European and the American Association for the Study of Liver Disease have rendered practice guidelines that address treatment of obesity for NASH. Lifestyle changes by diet and routine physical activity is mandatory in patients with NAFLD. The exclusion of fructose intake is very important, as this is a potent inducer of de novo lipogenesis. We recommend restriction and limitation of alcohol intake. 3 to 5% weight loss achieves improvement in steatosis, with higher degrees of weight loss of 7 to 10%, particularly in those who are overweight or obese, improves both liver enzymes and liver histology. Dietary recommendations should consider energy restriction and an adjustment of macronutrient composition to be in keeping with a Mediterranean-style diet. Both aerobic and resistance training reduce liver fat, but these should be tailored to a patient's preference with the goal of achieving long-term maintenance. So the FDA has approved several anti-obesity medications. However, recognize there are certainly common side effects associated with all these drugs, and that there is risk for drug-drug interaction, particularly in light of the polypharmacy, which exists in patients with obesity and diabetes. The placebo-subtracted weight loss varies anywhere between 3 to 6%. However, there's currently limited data on anti-obesity drugs and the effect they have on the histologic outcomes of NASH. However, there have been 2 compounds that have been evaluated, both orlistat and liraglutide, in randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies. Orlistat decreases liver fat, and in a parallel group, open-label 24-week randomized trial of 170 patients for which MRI-PDFF was used to evaluate the severity of quantitative liver fat, demonstrated that orlistat actually can significantly decrease quantitative liver fat compared to conservative care. And in the right upper hand panel, you'll see a liver fat reduction from 29% down to 8.2%, with a weight loss on average of 3 to 5% with orlistat. However, weight loss due to orlistat or diet improves biopsy-proven NASH. And in a study of 50 overweight patients with biopsy-proven NASH who received either diet and vitamin E with or without orlistat for 36 weeks, demonstrated that in those that received orlistat had a weight loss of 8.3% versus diet with vitamin E of 6%. But at these levels of weight loss, there was no difference between treatment groups, as both groups achieved improvement in the NAFLD activity score. but patients who achieved higher degrees of weight loss had a more significant improvement in steatosis, ballooning, and inflammation, with a more prominent decrease in the NAFLD activity score. Liraglutide has been evaluated in a phase 2 study of 52 patients with biopsy-proven NASH at a dose of 1.8 milligrams versus placebo, with the primary outcome being resolution of definite NASH with no worsening of fibrosis. And liraglutide met the primary endpoint, with 39% of patients achieving NASH resolution with no worsening of fibrosis, compared to 9% on placebo. And this was associated with a more significant change in weight, as well as an improvement in liver aminotransferases. Semaglutide has been evaluated in a phase 2 study of 320 patients with biopsy-proven NASH with fibrosis stage 1 to 3. And the intervention evaluated placebo versus a incremental dose escalation of semaglutide sub-Q once daily, with the primary outcome being resolution of NASH with no worsening of fibrosis. And the primary endpoint was met at all doses of semaglutide compared to placebo. The safety of GLP-1s in NASH was consistent with other trials in other disease areas, with the most common adverse event for both liraglutide and semaglutide being gastrointestinal. NASH resolution has also been evaluated with bariatric surgery, and in a 5-year follow-up study from Lille, France, demonstrated that up to 84% of patients with NASH at baseline resolved NASH completely at 5 years after bariatric surgery, and that this was also associated with an incremental improvement over time in fibrosis. And those patients that had mild fibrosis at the time of bariatric surgery, nearly 63% resolved fibrosis at 5 years, and in those with advanced fibrosis, nearly 45% resolved their fibrosis by 5 years. So, interestingly, exercise retards even liver cancer, and in an animal study right hot off the press in July of 2020 demonstrated that in the FAFA mouse, which is a hyperphagic, hyperinsulinemic, hyperlipidemic mouse, that sedentary mice, when given a carcinogenic agent, developed liver cancer, but when introduced to exercise, the burden of liver cancer actually decreases. And this has been associated with a retardation of weight gain, and improvement in insulin resistance, and an improvement in HOMA-IR. And a very large epidemiologic study published in 2013 demonstrated that vigorous physical activity 5 days a week in 415 patients decreased the risk of liver cancer by nearly 45%. What's even more exciting is that exercise and weight loss has been shown to decrease portal pressure. In 50 patients with cirrhosis, Child's class A, of whom 72% had a hepatic vein pressure gradient of more than 10 millimeters of mercury, after a 16-week lifestyle intervention, the mean improvement in weight loss was 5.2%, with 52% of patients achieving at least a 5% decrease in their body weight. And this was correlated with a mean reduction of 10% of hepatic vein pressure gradient. And those that achieved more than a 10% change in body weight had nearly a 25% improvement in hepatic vein pressure gradient. So in summary, by treating obesity, this is the foundation for the management of NAFLD and NASH. Anti-obesity therapies may be integral to the treatment of NAFLD and NASH, but require further investigation. Bariatric and surgery can resolve NASH and improve fibrosis in a majority of patients, and that treatment of obesity can decrease the risk of cirrhosis, liver cancer, and portal hypertension. Thank you.
Welcome to Obesity Week Interactive. I thank the organizers for inviting me to speak here today. I'm honored to speak at the presidential session on obesity and viral infections. I'm an obesity medicine physician and an endocrinologist. I am not a virologist. but I think certainly this topic is critical to consider, especially in the age of COVID-19. I'm going to start out discussing respiratory virus pandemics in the context of obesity. So in 1918, the influenza pandemic affected more than 300 million individuals worldwide, unfortunately killing 50 million. Now, of course, in 1918, we didn't know what this was. This was a mystery illness, and we didn't know that it was influenza. So an individual with obesity actually held the key to unlocking this mystery. So in 1951, a young Swedish scientist thought to go to Alaska to find the answer. So unfortunately, there was a small village in Alaska where 72 of the 80 villagers succumbed to the 1918 pandemic within a span of just 5 days. So Johan Holten and his colleagues at just age 25 traveled up to Alaska to look for the answer. They asked the elders for permission to excavate bodies of people who had succumbed to the pandemic. They did find bodies and identify tissue, but did not identify live virus. So fast forward 47 years, an article comes out in Science about genetic characterization of the 1918 influenza virus. And Johan Holten goes back to Alaska, now at age 72, to try and find the answers where he had not been able to find them before. And indeed he did. So he found a woman named Lucy, or that's what he named her, and she was buried under 7 feet of snow, and she had obesity. And this is how he described when he found her. I sat on a pail and looked at her. She was an obese woman. She had fat in her skin and around her organs that served as a protection for the occasional short-term thawing of permafrost. Those on the other side of her were not obese. They had decayed. I sat on the pail and saw this woman in a state of good preservation, and I knew that this was where the virus has got to come from, shedding light on the mysteries of 1918. And indeed, several years later, scientists were able to sequence the genome for the 1918 influenza virus. So I think this story highlights a few things. One is, of course, how an individual with obesity helped us years after the pandemic. 2, it's a story of perseverance and the scientist really going after what he was looking for to find the answers. And I encourage all of us to do the same. Now, in the 1950s and 1960s, 2 more influenza pandemics affected the world, affecting more than 1 million individuals in each pandemic and killing over 100,000 Americans. Now, if we look at obesity during that time, in Southeast Asia, it was less than 1%. In the United States, it was around 12%, which of course was coming up and raised the interest of George Bray and his colleagues. But it wasn't until the next pandemic in 2009 where obesity was really looked at. And in 2009, the prevalence of obesity in the United States was about 32%, or 1/3 of individuals. So in 2009, there were several articles that came out, and this one is very commonly cited, where they looked at individuals who were admitted with H1N1. And they found that 58% of individuals had obesity and 25% were characterized as having severe obesity. And for reference, in the United States in 2009, 4.9% of individuals had a BMI of greater than 40. So certainly a significantly higher proportion were being admitted with severe obesity. And these findings were replicated around the world. And obesity was identified as an independent risk factor for disease severity with H1N1, including hospitalization, intensive care, and mortality. Now, the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic also shed some light on additional things and considerations. So the duration of viral shedding and a vaccine elicited response. So the questions raised were, is viral shedding more pronounced in individuals with obesity, and is it of longer duration? And this was based on studies looking at individuals admitted to the hospital having higher viral load if they had obesity, and then also longer duration of shedding. In terms of vaccines, the question is, are flu vaccines as effective in individuals with obesity? And that's in consideration of altered cellular immune response and the question of whether immunity wanes more rapidly. And these questions are yet to be answered, but certainly were raised and critical for us to consider. So of course, these are all influenza viruses, and influenza is very different than coronavirus, and especially COVID-19. And indeed, the first 4 coronaviruses that were identified are rather mild and cause what we call the common cold. But of course, unfortunately, as we know, in 2002 and 2012, 2 more severe coronaviruses emerged. And then, of course, in 2019 with COVID. So let's focus in on coronaviruses now. So less is known about the 2 initial pandemics. SARS raised the question of cytokine storm, and obviously in COVID-19, there's the question of whether this will be more pronounced in individuals with obesity, and we don't know yet. And MERS, in terms of obesity, if you look at the studies, BMI is reported in some, at least in some portion of the individuals. And in one study, for example, in Saudi Arabia, where the pandemic was the most pronounced, 17% of individuals admitted had obesity with a prevalence of 33% at the time in the country. But the mortality in these individuals with obesity was 63%, which is higher than the already high mortality from MERS, which is 35%. So something definitely contributing to this. And one thought is acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, and that is yet to be elucidated. So now turning our attention to the pandemic at hand, COVID-19. So early on in the pandemic, there were already signs that obesity was linked to more severe coronavirus disease. And I couldn't help but notice, even back in April, that the descriptions were that young people with no health problems were succumbing to this illness, as this unfortunate 37-year-old man who died of COVID. And the thing that struck me was that all of these individuals were described as being healthy, and many of them had obesity. So early on in China, as well as in New York, where this study comes from, it was noted that a higher percentage of individuals who were hospitalized had obesity. So in this New York study, 40% of individuals had obesity, whereas the prevalence of obesity in New York City is about 22%. It was also found that obesity was a strong risk factor for hospitalization. So age, of course, was the strongest, followed by obesity, which was even stronger than heart failure. And so a slew of articles came out, or has come out since that time, really focusing in on the concept that obesity contributes to more severe COVID disease, COVID-19. And the CDC, in fact, expanded those who they consider at risk for severe COVID. So initially, they had obesity with a BMI greater than or equal to 40, which is severe obesity, and they added on then obesity with a BMI of greater than 30. And in fact, on their potential risk, increased risk list, they now have overweight as well. So why are individuals with obesity at higher risk for severe COVID? Well, I think a lot of it, of course, comes down to pathophysiology. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So back in April, an article came out discussing the potential mechanisms. And as I started giving these talks back then, of course, I had to add my own boxes with other potential mechanisms that we are all considering. So chronic systemic inflammation and altered immune function is, of course, critical and different in individuals with obesity. And there's an entire session on Friday that I encourage all of you to attend, looking at immune function in obesity. Respiratory dysfunction, not only mechanical, but even interventions such as proning patients, is more difficult in individuals with obesity. Comorbidities such as diabetes, and Dr. Drucker will give a session later today on common pathways of obesity and diabetes and infections, and I encourage you to attend that. Of course, metabolic dysfunction, even before diabetes occurs, such as insulin resistance and prediabetes, are important to consider. Also important are the hypercoagulable state of our patients with obesity, as well as medication considerations. So do individuals with obesity require different doses of medications or medications earlier in the course of treatment? And we don't know yet. And one other factor that isn't necessarily obesity pathophysiology, but I think is critical to remember, is stigma and bias. So if patients with obesity have faced stigma and bias their whole lives, which we know that they do, are they more likely to delay seeking treatment for their symptoms and therefore present with more severe COVID disease, potentially contributing to worse outcome? So I've highlighted here for you the sessions on obesity and COVID at Obesity Week. There are both oral sessions as well as symposia, and I encourage you to attend these and learn more. So in conclusion, an individual with obesity held the key which helped us unlock the mystery of the 1918 flu. And some questions for us to consider. What can viral infections teach us about obesity pathophysiology? What can obesity pathophysiology teach us about viral infections? And how does obesity pathophysiology affect the course, severity, requisite treatment, or prevention of viral infections or of COVID-19? And you see a theme here, of course, which is obesity pathophysiology. I think critical in all this, and has really been highlighted in this age of COVID, really underlining and underscoring the fact that obesity is a disease, which we all knew, but potentially has brought to a forefront for many others. One thing just to mention is to remember that H1N1 influenza is not SARS-CoV-2, is not other viruses. So as you're learning about all this, just remember that these viruses are very different from each other. There are similarities, but consider the differences as well. And of course, there's no doubt that more research is needed. And so I think in all this, whether it's viral infections or COVID-19, this is yet another critical and now urgent reason to treat obesity. So I thank you for your attention. I hope to see you at the rest of the sessions at Obesity Week Interactive this year. And I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks for this opportunity to present to the Presidential Plenary. My name is Joe Nadglowski. I'm President and CEO of the Obesity Action Coalition, and today I'm going to talk to you about a topic I'm extremely passionate about, and that is amplifying the patient voice. For the last 25 years, I've dedicated my career to giving a voice to people living with specific diseases, and the last 15 years have been spent giving that voice to people living with obesity. So today we're going to talk about the OAC, the organization I run, and the patient voice, the importance of that patient voice. We'll give you specific examples of the patient voice in action, and then give you some recommendations on how you can implement the patient voice in your practice, research, or clinical studies. So it was nearly 16 years ago now that an elected official stood up at a meeting on obesity and said, I'm asked every single day to do something about the obesity epidemic, but it's always by someone in public health or by a healthcare professional. He said, I've never actually had someone living with obesity walk into my office and ask for help. He pushed it even further. He said, you know what? I could pass a law today in my home state making a specific obesity treatment illegal. In this case, he used bariatric surgery, and not a single person who needed the treatment would march on my front steps. He goes, where are the patient voices? Where are the people living with this disease asking for help? And with that, the Obesity Action Coalition was born to do just that, to amplify the voice of people living with obesity. And now we have more than 75,000 members across the nation and in fact around the world who are engaging in such activities, sharing their stories, sharing their needs, and in trying to influence the way people with obesity are treated throughout the world. Now, this work couldn't have happened without a lot of dedicated people kind of laying the groundwork before us. And obviously, you know the stories of other disease advocates and other disease spaces, but also worth acknowledging the role that TOS has played some way in this as well, with Morgan Downey and his early work in trying to improve the voice of people living with obesity. So just a quick shout out here to Morgan and all the work he did that laid the groundwork for us to be able to create the OAC all those years ago. So I think it's probably obvious why the patient voice is important, but I really do want to emphasize this to you. There are about 100 million people now in the US living with obesity and more than 500 million around the world, yet it is one of the most misunderstood and stigmatized diseases. Somehow in our effort to make obesity bad, we've made the people with obesity bad. And the only way we are going to fix that is to actually amplify the voices of people living with obesity, so they can share their stories and let people understand that this is a condition that we need to better understand, and we need to empathize and be compassionate towards people living with instead of stigmatizing them. You know, the reality is 100 million people have obesity, and somehow we've been turned into a statistic, not into real people. We know treatments exist for obesity, yet access to these treatments is widely limited throughout the nation and frankly throughout the world. And this has to change. And a lot of this lies in the fact that we don't listen to the people living with obesity saying, I need help. We just wag a finger at them and say, well, do it on your own. And again, if we can amplify people's voices to change this and to change that view that this is a condition you have to deal with on your own, we could make a huge difference in people's lives. And of course, I think we all know that obesity does not discriminate. It does affect certain populations more than others, but it can affect people of all races, demographics, genders, and each experience is unique. And of course, the fact that each experience is unique is one of our challenges in addressing obesity with 100 million people affected. And again, another reason why it's important to listen to the people who actually live with this terrible disease. So how do we do this? And so at the OAC, we have lots of different ways we try to put the patient voice into action. You know, we have a system called Weight of the World where people can actually upload their videos on a private server to be shared with people who register in advance to actually share their experiences. And some of these experiences are very positive, where people have found their options to better their health and better their lives, and others are quite sad in that people are still struggling to find the right treatment options. It's what we see every single day with people living with obesity. We also have all kinds of publications where people actually share their stories in a public manner. We have an annual event called the Your Weight Matters Convention, where people are actually able to come and share their stories publicly. And we spend a lot of time, of course, moving on the policy side of this, where we actually take our patient advocates to Washington, D.C., to state capitals, to different regulatory bodies to actually share their stories. And I will tell you that the patient voice is essential. So for those of you who haven't been to Washington, D.C. with me or Chris Gallagher or the advocacy committee of the Obesity Society, it's something that you definitely want to do, but I will just warn you in advance what those elected officials and their staff want to hear. They want to hear from the people actually affected. And it's actually, when we walk into those offices, they'll often start off with, hey, Joe, it's good to see you again. How is so-and-so doing who you brought to visit last time? And that person so-and-so was actually the patient who came forward and actually was brave enough to share their stories. So it's important that you include patients as much as possible in any kind of effort when you're trying to raise these issues publicly or with policymakers. And you can see that through the other activities that we do at OEC, from our public awareness campaigns, including Obesity Care Week, which we partner with the Obesity Societies and many others on. And I think another novel thing that we've seen more and more over the last couple of years, and we see this in other conferences as well, is the inclusion of patients actually at your scientific meeting. And so we're excited here at Obesity Week, both last year and this year, to actually have patient advocates sharing their stories. Because the reality is we are actually, working to try to better these folks' lives, but we often don't ask them, hey, what does it take to better your life? And so it's great to see folks like that included at panels and other sessions here at Obesity Week. And of course, the media is another place. So if you're highlighting your research, why not include a patient with you who might have had personal experience with the issue you're addressing, to let them help emphasize some of the key issues. And again, to humanize this condition. Let's turn people away from just being a statistics. And we have lots of groups who have actually started these processes where they have patient experience advocates. And so, for example, you might be a company that works in this space, and you actually recruit a panel of patients to make sure you're hearing this information all along your development process and then your marketing process. Or even if you're a researcher, why not put together a group of patients to say what topics are important to you? Or if you're working on, say, for example, public health messages or similar, why not actually ask the patients what messages might actually be impactful to them? And we've seen a lot of novel activities around this space. And the reality is it shouldn't just be novel, right? It should be the norm. We should always recruit people living with obesity to be part of this research process as well as the clinical process as well. And so here are just some photo examples of patients in action. You see folks on Capitol Hill, to people publicly sharing their stories at major events or hearings. You see people writing articles and that, participating in videos. And of course, one of the ways we see most dynamically people sharing their stories is on social media. And it's a great opportunity to be able to change messages, to change hearts, and to change minds. And then, of course, in the news media as well. And, it's often challenging for our folks to come forward and share their story publicly because, as you know, in society, we have a lot of what we call trolls, and people push back against this. But I would just challenge you, if you see stories that feature a patient sharing their public experience with obesity, be supportive of them. And if you see a troll in the message boards or other places on social media, for example, push back, right? We need to actually stand up for our patients who are brave enough to share their voices and share their stories as we try to better their lives. Here's a great quote from OEC's vice chair, soon to be chair, Patty Neese. Let's continue to elevate voices that help promote the truth about weight and let people with obesity know they are not alone. And that really is the goal of amplifying voices. Obesity is very, very prominent, but most of us who live with it feel as if we are very, very alone. So here are my final recommendations. Please use the patient voice in your practices, research projects, etc. If you need help recruiting patient advocates to guide you in any of your projects, reach out to the Obesity Action Coalition. My contact information is on the next slide. Understand that every voice is different and every journey with obesity is a lifelong one. Healthcare is one of the highest rated areas of weight bias for someone living with obesity. Empathy is crucial. That's what our patient voices are telling us. Empathy is crucial to opening up the conversation of weight with patients. And lastly, remember that all patients are human and have most likely dealt with bias in every facet of their life from childhood to obesity. Their voice matters, including their voice in your clinical practice, in your research, and your public health activities is essential. If we really want to get our hands around this obesity epidemic and finally make some progress in addressing it, I think it's important that we listen to the people who are affected. So please help us in amplifying the voice of people living with obesity. Thank you very much. Here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to OEC if we can help you in any way. Thanks again.
Welcome back to the presidential plenary session. At this time, I'd like to announce and give the Presidential Medals of Distinction from the Obesity Society to this year's awardees. And I'm delighted to report that we have 3 awardees this year whom I will introduce right now. Since 2014, the leadership of the Obesity Society has given medals of distinction to people in different fields of endeavor who have contributed significantly to our understanding, treatment, and prevention of obesity. For this year, as I mentioned, we have 3 awardees, and I'm going to go through them now and introduce you to them in alphabetical order. The first awardee, who is likely well known to all of you, is Roxane Gay, who's an author and an essayist, and who's best known in our field for having written a personal memoir about hunger and about her own obesity called Hunger, A Memoir of My Body. She has a whole variety of contributions that she's made to the modern literature, including as an essayist, as an editor of essays, as a fiction writer, both in the short and the long form. But for today, I want to emphasize the fact that she, having lived with obesity, has really given us an important perspective. You could say from the patient perspective, but I would say just simply from the perspective of a person living with obesity. The citation for her award is for giving voice to the challenges, frustration, self-prejudice, and relentlessness of obesity through her powerful and insightful writing. Roxane, congratulations, and thank you very much for all you've contributed to our field.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It means a lot for hunger in particular to be recognized by medical professionals. I really wanted to expand the conversation around fatness, and to know that doctors are indeed reading my book means the world.
Our second awardee is Ted Kyle. Ted is an active member and of the Obesity Society, and a leader in the Obesity Society. But for more than a decade now, he has been the editor of a newsletter called Conscious Health that he puts out every day, Saturdays and Sundays and holidays included, that really provides an extraordinarily insightful perspective on the field of obesity, the field of medicine generally, or health generally, but with a particular focus on obesity and body weight. He's an advocate for better care, for better prevention, just for taking obesity seriously. His early career was as a pharmacist and as a director of policy and innovation at GlaxoSmithKline. But his contributions through Conscious Health, which he founded, have been absolutely extraordinary, and some would argue even eclipse what he had done in all those decades earlier. The citation for his award is for being a steady conscience to all who study, prevent, treat, or have obesity, each day helping separate fact from opinion and evidence from preconception. Ted, congratulations and thank you.
Thank you, Lee. I feel a bit of imposter syndrome because of the amazing people also receiving this award, Rudolph Leibel and Roxane Gay. But above all, I appreciate the encouragement of so many people in this field, beginning 2 decades ago with Tom Wadden, John Ferret, George Blackburn, and Carolina Povian. And of course you, Lee. Without that, I probably would not be doing what I do. So thank you. The work that all of you do is truly inspiring.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our third awardee, Dr. Rudolph Leibel. I think everyone in our community knows Rudy from his enormous contributions and participation in the community itself. He was our keynote speaker 2 years ago at the Obesity Society. And of course, he has made enormous numbers and of important contributions to our field, scientifically and clinically. Dr. Leibel is a physician, a geneticist, a scientist. He comes at his work from the perspective of a pediatrician. He's the Christopher J. Murphy Professor of Diabetes at Columbia and Professor of Pediatrics and Medicine, also at Columbia. He's co-director of the Naomi Berry's Diabetes Center there, and is the director of the New York Obesity and Nutrition Research Center, amongst his many, many other responsibilities. He's received more awards than any of us has time to list here. But the reason we're honoring him with this TOS award is because he has made the kinds of contributions that have allowed now at least 2 more generations of scientists and clinicians to extend our understanding and to develop better approaches both to the prevention and treatment of obesity. The citation for his award is for the discovery of leptin and identifying key characteristics of the physiological regulation of body weight and fat mass, thus enabling discovery, understanding, and therapeutic targeting of the molecular circuitry underlying obesity. Congratulations, Dr. Leibel, and thank you as well for your important contributions.
Lee and others, I want to thank you for this really wonderful honor. I started work in this area of investigation pretty late in my career by most standards, but was lucky to do so when the tools of molecular genetics were just enabling the study of contributions of genes to mouse and human obesity. And it's now clear that human obesity reflects the intersection of genetic and developmental environmental influences, the relative predominance of which varies within an individual or by individuals. These influences work to create a situation in which body fat is defended, and studies by my associates and I and many others, including you, Lee, are just starting to reveal how these processes work, and hopefully will bear substantial fruit with regard to the issues that confront the Obesity Society, its members, and others in our populations. I've been so privileged to work with outstanding mentors and associates, and it's these interactions and efforts that I continue to find most rewarding. So this recognition is really theirs, and I am proud to accept it in their behalves and to again thank the Obesity Society for this recognition, but more importantly, for what it does to convene the individuals in our both academic and patient care and community circumstances who have to deal with this enormous issue over extended periods of time and across large numbers of individuals. So thanks again, and keep up the good work.
Once again, I'd like to congratulate each of our awardees, Roxane Gay, Ted Kyle, and Rudy Leibel. Each of you in your own way, working in your own field of endeavor, has contributed enormously to our understanding of obesity. Thank you for helping us understand obesity. Thank you for your contributions, and congratulations. It's been a great pleasure to talk with our colleagues who have won the presidential medals. But in particular, I really enjoyed listening to all of the talks this morning in this session, which have been provocative, educational, and just a lot of fun. I'm going to turn now to the last talk of this session, which is the presidential talk. And I'm going to focus my attention in this talk on really where we might go as a field, as a society, as individual investigators, clinicians, and others interested in solving the problem of obesity. The title of my talk this morning is Rewriting the Script on Obesity. And it comes from one of the great joys that I've experienced as member of the leadership group within the Obesity Society over the last several years. One of the joys we get is that we work with people, colleagues, others outside of the field whose focus on obesity is often quite different. It's in a different aspect of obesity from our own. And one of those opportunities for me was to work with and discuss the planning for Healthy People 2030 and the role of obesity in Healthy People 2030. So I want to talk a little bit about that as I enter into the discussion of the future. Now, the Healthy People Initiative was put together by the Department of Health and Human Services beginning in 1979 to identify national health improvement priorities across several disease states. It establishes benchmarks for progress And the first healthy people targeted 1990. And of course, there have been several since, and the one for 2020 has just completed. And I looked at some of the data with respect to obesity and healthy people 2020, and I want to show you what we found. Well, first of all, we characterized 3 types of goals within the Healthy People program. We characterized outcome goals, which are objective clinical outcomes. How are we doing? Is the prevalence of a disease going down, going up, staying the same? We also looked at process goals, changes in provider behaviors, clinical access, and procedures that would either facilitate or interfere with achieving the clinical outcomes. And finally, in the case of obesity and related diseases, we looked at nutrition and activity goals, changes in patient behaviors related to eating or physical activity that are thought to be determinant in body weight regulation and the cause and solution for obesity. And I want to show you some of the results, but before I do, I just want to give you a list. We're not going to go through all these in detail, but these are the obesity outcomes goals. They increase the proportion of adults who are at a healthy weight, reduce the proportion of adults who have obesity, and onward down the line. They all fall in the nutrition category, NWS, except for 2 at the bottom that fall within the heart disease category. But essentially, they are all obesity or BMI related goals. Now, if you look at how successful we've been between 2010 and 2020 at achieving these outcomes goals, you can see here that we've not been very successful. In fact, in every case, we've moved away from the goal. So things are worse at the end of the decade than they are at the beginning of the decade. And that's demonstrated in this slide by a decrease in activity away from, or negative 100%. Negative 100% in the first goal here means that we've gone as far away from the goal as it would have taken to go to the goal, or we're twice as far from the goal as when we started. Now, if you compare other similar or related disease categories, if you look at diabetes outcome goals, you can see that in most cases, the diabetes outcome goals have not only been addressed, but when you see more than 100%, it means we've exceeded the goal. So for the first diabetes goal shown here, we've gone almost twice as far. We've exceeded the goal and gone further. And in the case of diabetes second goal here, we've gone about 2/3 of the way toward the selected goal. If you look here at the heart disease outcome goals, you can see that in most of the cases, we've gone toward the goal. In many cases, we've achieved the goal. And in only 2 cases shown on the right here, have we moved away from the goal. Now I want to then look at cancer. And in the case of cancer, you can see we basically are moving toward the goal in virtually every case. So why is it that we're doing so much more poorly in obesity than we are doing for diabetes, heart disease, and cancer? And so we then looked at obesity process goals listed here, and obesity-related nutrition goals listed here. And once again, you can see that in the case of outcome goals, we're moving away from the target in every case. But in the case of obesity process goals, all of the things that we think would facilitate moving toward the goal, we're actually doing quite well. And this is quite different. If you go back in history and you look at healthy people 2000 and 2010, what you see is that we hadn't been doing very well with the process goals. But now we're doing very well, and yet the outcomes are still in the wrong direction. Looking at the nutrition and physical activity related goals, once again, you can see in most cases, we are moving toward those goals. And despite doing so, again, shown on the left, we're moving away from the outcome goals, the hard outcomes that would indicate that we're having success in controlling the problem of obesity. Well, this is very disturbing, because if you think about obesity and its effect on the lives of people who have it, and frankly, on all of society, moving away from our targets and recognizing, if you look even more deeply into these data, that each cycle, each decade, our targets are getting less and less ambitious. Our targets initially were to go from about 22% obesity to 15%. So the goal was 15% prevalence of obesity. And now our targets are to go from 40 or 41% obesity down to about 35, 36% obesity. So our targets are much less ambitious than they were, and yet we still don't meet them. Well, when you think about the profound effects of obesity, it's not just that it causes disease. Obesity actually affects society and individuals in society to a much greater extent, as shown here. Of course, it causes clinical complications due to the mechanical changes caused by obesity and the pathophysiological changes. And those complications fall into multiple categories, including metabolic, inflammatory, cancers, degenerative complications that take time to develop, complications that themselves are mechanical, psychological complications, with more than 225 medical complications affecting every organ system. But beyond that, obesity interferes with the management of all disease due to the mechanical changes that are caused by obesity, the physiological alterations, and diminished access to care, which gets into the social determinants of disease. And these interference is interference with screening, with diagnosis, and with treatment of all these other diseases, whether or not they're caused by or related to obesity. And it affects these components of the management of disease in every organ system, in every subspecialty. And it doesn't really matter whether the disease is associated with obesity or not. But obesity does more, unfortunately. Through stigma, discrimination, and the psychological effects of obesity on the people who have it, and the psychopathology in the people who don't have obesity, what you can see is you develop increasing social exclusion. That social exclusion includes psychological injury from the exclusion, social disparities, alienation, which then leads to a vicious cycle. These social effects of obesity affect every interaction, whether they be professional, personal, family, or what have you. And finally, obesity, again through stigma and discrimination, but also through the physical impairment that particularly severe obesity can cause, causes economic impairment amongst people who have it, diminished opportunities for work, lower pay, barriers to promotion, affecting every industry. And all of these interactions build upon each other in ways shown here with all these arrows to synergistically damage the lives of the people who have obesity, the people who are close to those people, and society as a whole. Now, obesity interference with clinical care includes interference with access to care, to screening for diseases, to diagnostic testing, to treatment, and perhaps most importantly, to data interpretation and clinical decision-making by all of us, who may or may not recognize that diseases may present differently in those with obesity, and that the differential diagnosis of particular symptoms can be skewed completely differently in those with obesity, particularly severe obesity, than they are in people who have normal weight. I want to turn now to the issue of the biology underlying obesity. And I want to start by emphasizing that body fat mass, by all evidence, is a physiologically related phenotype. From a clinical perspective, just observationally, we know that at multiple stages during development, the loss of baby fat, the fat changes that are associated with puberty differentially in boys and girls, fat changes with aging and menopause. But even more dramatically, the fat changes during and after pregnancy and lactation, in animals before and after hibernation, in birds and butterflies before and after long distance migration. These occur spontaneously, autonomically, without interference by voluntary behavior. In fact, obesity looks a lot like some of these changes, except that it results from inappropriate or pathophysiological regulation of body fat mass rather than the physiological regulation that occurs at all these other stages of development. This is critical in terms of our understanding of the biology of obesity, as well as how to solve it. Now, at most times during adult life anyway, the body seeks a stable fat mass that's similar to other regulated tissues like the liver, or red blood cell mass. These can be regulated. In the case of red blood cells, it can be regulated by moving to an elevated environment, such as the Rocky Mountains or the like. You'll tend to regulate your red blood cell mass to a higher level, and it'll go back down again when you go back to sea level. But if you remove any of these tissues, either by phlebotomy or by surgical resection, what will happen is the body will respond by returning, by restoring the original mass of tissue. And that is true whether you do lipectomy as well as whether you do partial hepatectomy for transplant or phlebotomy for blood donation. What this means then, when you put it all together broadly, is that obesity results from a dysfunction of normal fat mass regulatory mechanisms such that you have an elevated defended fat mass. Now, there's been a lot of controversy over the term fat mass set point. But the set point is only set for a few minutes after all, because if in the next minute you go through one of these physiological or developmental changes, that set point changes. So set point isn't so much set. And so I like to say defended body fat mass, which changes and is regulated physiologically. What this also means is that overeating is not what causes obesity. And in fact, people who don't have obesity or don't have a predisposition to obesity and try to gain a lot of weight find it almost impossible to do so, except for the very, very short period of time. You can gain weight and you force yourself, but then your body wants to lose that weight. It's obesity itself that drives the overeating. And it also means that undereating then doesn't fix obesity. Fixing obesity by whatever means you do it effectively leads to undereating. And we know that when we look at bariatric surgery and effective medications. And we also know that with certain lifestyle-based therapies in certain individuals where merely the change of lifestyle leads to weight loss without apparent effort. So I want to talk then about physiological versus counter-physiological weight loss. In physiological weight loss, which again can be this targeted lifestyle change where the lifestyle works on the physiological abnormality, or with effective medications or surgery, here you have a defended fat mass that I'm going to arbitrarily say in purple here is elevated. You have an individual in whom you treat with whatever effective therapy you've got. And what that does is it changes the body's desired fat mass, leading to a lower so-called set point. What the body does in response to that is it instigates a physiological set of programs that decrease appetitive drive, increase thermogenesis to drive the fat mass down to where the body now wants it to be. When that happens, of course, the patient or the individual loses weight. And maintaining that weight loss is pretty straightforward. Within a certain degree. Obviously there could be progression of obesity, but it's because the body is seeking to maintain that set point, the drive to regain the lost weight is either absent or strongly diminished. In contrast, counter-physiological or non-physiological weight loss, an example could be calorie restriction. There are also certain types of older surgery that are mechanical rather than physiological that do this. But in this case, the defended fat mass is maintained as you lose weight. Isolated caloric restriction has not been shown in animals or people to change the defended fat mass. And so what that means is acutely you lose weight, but that stimulates a series of physiological programs, including increased appetitive drive, increased hedonic drive to eating, and decreased thermogenesis that acts in a restorative way to try to restore the weight back to the original. This has been seen in studies of The Biggest Loser TV contestants, as well as other studies by Rudolph Leibel and Michael Rosenbaum. In all cases, simple caloric restriction leads to what has been called the need for a maintenance phase, but what I would call the restorative phase, where the body is trying to restore the original fat mass to what it was before the weight loss. So there must be physiological programs then in the body to establish the current target fat mass and to be able to change it during these various phases of normal human development. And then if you arbitrarily move off the target fat mass, either because of injury, illness, or dieting, or even if you're a Hollywood actor or actress, you try to go to a higher fat mass, then there must be a process to store fat if the body is below the target fat mass, which may be the inverse, but it may not be, of another process to mobilize fat if the body is above the target fat mass. And the body will be above the target fat mass in the case of effective therapy, because the fat mass, the target fat mass, is lowered by effective therapy. Think surgery, think effective medications, think effective lifestyle interventions. And so the body then has to find a way to get down. And so how each of these programs is affected in various types of obesity and how they respond to different treatment and prevention strategies could strongly facilitate not only better control of the disease, but better subtyping, because it's likely that these complex physiological programs are differentially affected in different types of obesity that respond differentially to different therapies. So let's talk about this heterogeneity and the differential response to different therapies. As shown here, if you look at a diet, any diet, but I'm showing you a low carbohydrate diet, you can see the distribution of weight change outcomes. To the right of the vertical black bar, you see the people who have the numbers of people in the study who have lost anywhere from 0 to 5 upwards to 25 to 30% of their initial weight. To the left of the vertical black bar, you see people who've gained weight to variable degrees. On average, a low carbohydrate diet causes about a 5 to 10%, somewhere between 5 and 10% weight loss on average. But some people to the far right lose bariatric levels of weight, and to the far left, some people actually gain weight. And this is true of a low carb diet, a low glycemic index diet, a balanced diet, a low fat diet, an Ornish diet. Any of these diets have the same type of distribution. Now, there are some genetic studies that demonstrate that some people respond better to a low carb diet, others respond better to a low fat diet, and we certainly have animal models that support this variability in what a diet does to body fat mass and weight. But what about medications? If you look at medications, I'm using liraglutide here, but we've looked at every medication that's been approved and some that haven't been approved but are used off-label for the treatment of obesity, and you see the same thing. The breadth of the curve, the variability is just as great. And you can see on liraglutide in the studies that were submitted to the FDA for approval, some people gained weight, as shown here on the left. Some people lose bariatric levels of weight, 20 to 35% of their weight, not too many. And most people lose between 5 and 10%. If you look at devices, this is the endobarrier, or a plastic device that lines the duodenum and is meant to reproduce some of the effects of bariatric surgery. You see that the curve is shifted to the right. Nobody's gaining weight, but the breadth of the distribution is the same. And finally, if you look at bariatric surgery, you're using gastric bypass as an example. Once again, the curve is shifted even further to the right. The average weight loss, of course, is bariatric levels of weight loss by design. But the variability, the standard deviation across these curves between 10 and 11% is identical no matter which type of intervention and which particular drug, diet, device, or surgical procedure that is done. Well, what this allows, and what the additional knowledge about surgery being physiological in most cases does, is it tells us that if surgery worked mechanically, by restriction or by malabsorption, the best you could expect is a medication which works physiologically or pharmacologically would be additive with the mechanical effects of surgery. You get a big effect of surgery shown here on the left, a relatively smaller effect of medications, and you'd at best add the two together, maybe even less than that. But because surgery, which is the most powerful therapy we have, has now been shown to work physiologically, it is possible that you can get complementarity between the mechanisms of surgery and of medications, such as the overall effect of surgery plus medications is greater than the sum of the effects of each individual intervention alone. And this has been seen in a number of studies anecdotally, but in particular in the Gravitas study published last year that looked at patients with diabetes who had undergone bariatric surgery and were treated with liraglutide or placebo. And once again, you saw that the combination was not only additive, but in many cases synergistic. This is the importance of looking at obesity from a physiological rather than a mechanical or voluntary basis. Now, when we look at medications, of course, in addition to their ability to augment surgery, we've seen a dramatic improvement and a continued anticipation of improvement over the next several years, as shown here. I want to just show you sort of as bookends here. We have intensive lifestyle therapy, which is effective, repeatedly demonstrably effective, usually about 4% weight loss if you look at the best studies after 4 years. If you look at bariatric surgery after about 5 to 10 years, it's between 30 and 35% effective. The current procedures are just a little over 30% effective at 5 to 10 years. If you look at medications, though, they haven't been terribly much more effective than lifestyle. A little bit of a blip for fen-phen in the 1990s, until recent years when we're beginning to see that with combination therapies used carefully, with targeting of the particular medications to patients who respond to them, which is what we do clinically, and with the advent of new medications, semaglutide, for which the phase 3 data are being reported at this meeting, some of the phase 3 data, and recently reported phase 2 data for the combination of semaglutide and cagrilintide, which is an amylin agonist. You can see that for the first time, we're beginning to see a steady rise in the efficacy of medications such that it's getting into the range of where bariatric surgery is. This will change the complexion of treating obesity over the next decade. In fact, one of the slides that we've all used for at least 20 years is the slide that shows that surgery is effective, lifestyle and medications are relatively much less effective. And there's always been the need to solve this treatment gap problem. We've all talked about it repeatedly. But what I would say is with the advent of some of the newer medical devices, but more importantly, with the improvement in the efficacy of medications to treat obesity, we're starting to fill that treatment gap. And starting to fill that treatment gap will allow us to develop therapies that are appropriate for all people with obesity, not just the ones at the lower end who need a little bit of intervention and who are more seriously affected at the high end who need something like bariatric surgery. Where this takes us in terms of utilization, access to care, reimbursement, and all of those questions remains to be seen. But I think that the development of more effective non-invasive therapies for obesity is going to have a big impact. Now, part of that impact, of course, is dependent upon recognizing that obesity is a disease. But it's not a disease because we deemed it so. It's a disease because, as I've already indicated, it results from abnormal physiology. It's a disease because it causes pathology, but itself is a pathophysiological state. It's a disease because it diminishes health. It also causes abnormal physiology and other diseases. It disrupts metabolic functioning. It disrupts immune functioning. So therefore, it's a risk factor for other diseases, but it needs to be recognized, respected, treated, and prevented as a disease in its own right because it is, not because we wish it to be. So, looking to the future, from a scientific perspective, we need to understand the complex physiological regulatory strategies that underlie obesity. Those regulatory strategies that the body uses at different stages of the life course in response to different biological needs are the very regulatory strategies that are disrupted in obesity. We need to distinguish the regulatory strategy from the molecules, the regulatory circuits, and other mechanisms used to execute the strategy. Because frequently we know a lot about mechanisms, but we don't know about the strategies that the mechanisms are aiming to satisfy or to execute. Think about it from the point of view, we could understand our heating and air conditioning system of our houses very well. And we can understand the mechanisms by which the boiler sends heat to the various parts of the house and the air conditioning through other ducts cools the house. But fundamentally, we don't understand the way the system is working unless we understand the concept of the thermostat and how the thermostat is sensing the temperature and what kinds of signals it's sending to the boiler and to the air conditioning system to execute the overall strategy. And that the overall strategy is determined by what the thermostat is set at. And so for the body's fat mass, we need to understand how that lipostat or adipostat is set, as well as how it's protected. We need to distinguish the state of obesity, having too much fat, from the process of gaining or losing weight, which is really energy imbalance. If somebody has or weighs 350 pounds and has for the last 20 years, they've been in perfect energy balance for 20 years, but they still have obesity. And if you gain weight or lose weight at an appropriate time and in an appropriate way, physiologically appropriate way, you don't have obesity even though you're in energy imbalance. So the conflation of energy imbalance and obesity is the wrong thing. What we need to do is we need to focus on obesity as a state rather than focusing on obesity as the act of gaining weight or even excess hunger. We have to understand how specific components of the modern environment alter these regulatory strategies and mechanisms. We need to distinguish the systems that determine the fat mass from those that serve to maintain it. We need to define the specific physiological and molecular disruptions that underlie different obesity subtypes and their respective phenotypes, and identify components of these regulatory strategies that can be targeted to overcome, and secondarily, but even more importantly, to prevent the alterations that lead to obesity in this modern obesogenic world we live in. From a clinical perspective, we need to distinguish overeating from weight gain because they're not the same. And so we need to take a more effective weight and obesity history that distinguishes those and that determines what the triggers to weight gain are, which may or may not be the same as the triggers to overeating. And we have to use these in the design, the evaluation, and the application of anti-obesity therapy. We have to embrace the biological heterogeneity that I've already talked about and use it to design, evaluate, and implement treatment strategies. It makes no sense to look at obesity as a monolithic disorder if it isn't, and if people are going to respond differently to different approaches. Someday we need to have ways to predict how they're going to respond. And we have to anticipate that the heterogeneity is equally applicable to the design of prevention strategies. And that hasn't been done at all to this point. We need to demand as clinicians and be early adopters of emerging tools to predict disease and treatment outcomes. And we have to develop better severity scores based on clinical impact more than a person's appearance. We also need to, as clinicians, need to understand the known biology of obesity in sufficient detail to be able to apply it in choosing, implementing, and evaluating treatment strategies. We need to be clear-eyed about our failures as well as our successes. And in the face of success, we have to aggressively pursue why so that we can augment that success or improve upon that success. And in the face of failure, we have to be willing to question all of the underlying assumptions that we bring to the table. We have to distinguish between physiological and non-physiological weight loss that I already talked a little bit about, and appreciate that with non-physiological treatments, short-term weight loss does not predict long-term outcomes. That's only predicted with physiological weight loss. From a clinical perspective, we also need to demand and base our clinical decision-making exclusively on high-quality, well-controlled long-term studies. We need to distinguish between statistical and clinical significance and push forward with studies that examine both. We need to understand and base our clinical decisions on the difference between correlation and causation. We can't merely state that there's a difference and that correlation doesn't cause causation or doesn't imply causation. We have to make sure that we apply that difference. We have to design and implement care models and strategies that are patient-focused rather than treatment-focused. And the mode and effectiveness of treatment should not be determined by the site of initial contact. If you go to a surgeon, you shouldn't automatically get surgery. If you go to a dietitian, you shouldn't automatically get dietary weight loss to the exclusion of everything else. Patient-focused treatment has to be the order of the day going forward. From an education and training perspective, we need to train a generation of what I like to call bilingual professionals, scientists who understand human obesity, not just animal obesity, in all of its manifestations, biological effects, social implications, and importantly, variability. We need scientists who can effectively communicate the clinical implications of their discoveries so that they can be applied to patients. We need clinicians who understand the underlying science well enough to use it to achieve more effective clinical care. And we need both scientists and clinicians who understand that whatever its original cause in individual patients, that cause ultimately leads to obesity by disrupting normal physiological regulatory systems. And I would argue that neither the scientists nor the clinicians nor any of us is any better than any other of us at this understanding, which is intrinsic to recognizing obesity as a disease. We need to educate policymakers and policy users to appreciate the rapid changes in our understanding of the biology and implications and increasing the tools to treat obesity. We need to educate the public more effectively to elevate their obesity literacy. We need to include the modern understanding of obesity in the curriculum at all levels of education from secondary school onward, maybe even before. We need to distinguish obesity from wellness, nutrition, and behavior. They all overlap, but obesity cannot be explained as a subset or as a result of variations in any one of these areas. We need to educate everyone that not only that obesity is a disease, but why it's a disease and what that means for its prevention and treatment. And we need to distinguish between the disease of obesity and the social desire to lose weight. And the confusion between those two interferes with almost every aspect of effective care and access to care. And finally, from every perspective, we need to reduce the stigma, the prejudice, and the discrimination that interferes with progress in reducing obesity across the spectrum of ways that we do it. Overall, we need to up our game. Given the ubiquity of obesity and its continued unabated growth, the health, the well-being, the social and economic success of individuals with obesity and of the entire human population absolutely depends on it. I want to give some thanks at the end of this talk to all the people who have worked in my laboratory and in our center, all our trainees and the colleagues who've worked very closely with us that have allowed me to do the work that I do and allowed me to talk about certain aspects of it today. They're all listed here. There are too many to name and go into detail, but none of us works alone. And this group of people that's shown here are the people who have helped me do my work over the last 20 years. I also want to thank, as I end my presidency year for the Obesity Society, the people shown here on the left, beginning with Tony Camuzzi, the CEO of the Obesity Society, are all the members of the staff of the society who have put this meeting together and done all the work that's necessary to execute on the goals of our society, to improve the health and the well-being of patients with obesity across the world. On the right, I want to give thanks to my predecessors and colleagues on the executive committee, Penny Gordon-Larson, Alan Levine, who were presidents of the Obesity Society before I was on the executive committee, Caroline Apovi and Steve Heimsfield, who preceded me, and Kathy Kotz and Dan Bessison, who will follow me as president of the society, and Dale Scholler and Leah Wiggum, who've served as secretary treasurer during my time on the executive council, on the executive committee. Each of them has strongly influenced me, and I hope that I have been able to help them as they either were working before me or after me to further the goals of our society. And finally, during the past year, I have to be particularly thankful, and I am particularly thankful for the generosity of all members of my family shown here, who have allowed me to disappear a lot, even in the setting of COVID, where I've spent far more time at home than I ever have. Most of that time has been working, and a bunch of that time has been pulled away to the work of the Obesity Society. And I'm very grateful for them for allowing me to do that. Now, at the end of this session, I want to pause for a second to welcome you again to the Obesity Week Interactive. In 2020, we've had to do this meeting in a different way, as we talked about earlier. But I want to express again my appreciation for all of the speakers who've had to pre-record their talks, all of the abstract presenters, whether in poster form or in oral form, who've had to prepare all of their materials in advance and frequently record them. To the sponsors, to the exhibitors, to the collaborating societies that are sharing in some of the program that we are presenting to you this week, to the TOS staff who've made it all happen, and to all of you who've joined us and have been willing to join us in this unusual format. I hope you enjoy the meeting. I hope it's a productive meeting for each of you and useful. And unfortunately, I suspect it'll have to be useful in some manner for at least the next little while as the COVID-19 disruption resolves itself. Welcome to the meeting. Enjoy the week. Look forward to seeing you.